This screencast lecture introduces our discussion of doctrines that excuse performance, but also implicate important regulatory objectives. Thus, the topic bridges the performance and regulation categories in our graphical map of the course. You read my textbook Introduction to Misrepresentation Doctrine, several cases involving real estate sales, and an excerpt from Tony Kronman's important economic analysis of nondisclosure. The law's treatment of nondisclosure and concealment rests on the foundation of misrepresentation doctrine. The purpose of this first part of the screencast lecture is to introduce you to these basic legal principles and the policy objectives they pursue. As I suggested in the textbook, the principal goal of misrepresentation doctrine is to deter people from providing false information. Investments in creating false information, like Kathy's efforts with Photoshop, are wasteful. And false information also distorts important economic decisions. For example, Josh would rather not buy a car with engine problems. By allowing adversely affected parties to rescind contracts, and sometimes by even imposing tort or even criminal liability for fraud as well, the law of misrepresentation promotes more truthful exchanges of information. But we must also think about the other side of the transaction. One-sided liability could give promisors too much freedom to escape from contractual obligations that they've now come to regret. Just allege some false statement during negotiations, and you could potentially rescind any ill-advised promises you've made. Thus, courts also want to provide efficient incentives for care to those who receive representations. Let's take a close look at the language of Restatement Section 164 to see how courts limit the right to void a contract for misrepresentation. Notice that the representation must induce assent, and the recipient must be justified in relying on the representation. These provisions give courts the ability to refuse rescission when the recipient didn't rely. For example, when Josh had already agreed to buy the car from Lillian, or when Josh should have known that her statement was false. For example, if Josh is a master mechanic and Lillian's statement makes no sense. As you can see, these rules give Josh an incentive to take care in evaluating and relying on Lillian's representations. This situation is closely analogous to the rule we saw in Drennan and Pavel, when a subcontractor makes an obvious error in bidding on a construction project. The general contractor can't reasonably rely on that bid. Here, once again, a compound liability rule aims to influence both the primary behavior of making representations and the secondary behavior of receiving and evaluating them. As a technical doctrinal matter, Restatement Section 164 applies to both fraudulent or knowing misrepresentations and material, negligent or innocent misrepresentations. But there are some tendencies in the cases worth knowing about. First, knowing misrepresentations typically justify rescission, unless the representation did not in fact induce assent. Again, think of the hypo in which Lillian's misrepresentation to Josh came after Josh's assent to the contract. But when one party makes a knowing misrepresentation, courts usually don't inquire too closely whether it was reasonable for the other party to rely on that representation. A contrary rule might encourage unscrupulous parties to engage in a practice we can call prospecting for suckers. For example, a seller could make outrageous claims that no reasonable person would believe. If enough suckers accept and rely on the seller's story, those sales could make the strategy worthwhile. But the success of this strategy depends on the seller being able to avoid rescission by arguing that the suckers weren't justified in relying on her outrageous representation. Courts avoid this problem and deter prospecting for suckers by focusing solely on whether the representation in fact induced assent to the contract. Second, you should know that negligent misrepresentations that induce assent usually lead to rescission, unless the recipient was also negligent in relying on the statement. I've seen some tendency in cases for courts to think of the problem in comparative terms. so whoever is more negligent will probably bear the risk. Once again, courts are using a compound liability rule to create incentives for both parties to take care in making and relying on representations. Although the case involved mistake rather than misrepresentation doctrine, recall that in Anderson against O'Meara, O'Meara's lack of care played a crucial role in precluding rescission for a unilateral mistake. Third, notice that Restatement Section 160 treats act of concealment as equivalent to a knowing misrepresentation. The clearest example of concealment in our readings is in Abdi against Schliemeyer, where the seller's partial treatment concealed evidence of a severe termite infestation. Finally, you'll soon see that the most interesting and challenging cases involve a failure to disclose. But for now, recognize the basic structure of the doctrine. It turns on a deceptively simple question. Is there a duty to disclose? Thanks for listening.